what UGGI conversation is all about. This idea came about through Thomas and the Green Institute, UG Green Institute. And it was meant really to be a webinar, yes, but different from the standard webinars that UGGI has been hosting. And when I say standard, I don't mean that in a derogatory sense. I just mean that this one was meant to have an additional component. That is, it was meant to appeal more to students, to be a little less academic. And so we did a lot of brainstorming about how could we ensure or at least encourage maximum student participation, which tends to be lacking in many of the other webinars or other online discussions. So we came up with the idea that if we want students to participate, we have to involve them from the inception. And this means allowing or creating some mechanism by which students could actually select the topics for discussion, which is likely to encourage participation or encourage their attendance at the events. And it also gives us a better sense of what students are interested in, because many times, we think we know and we think we have all the answers, and we neglect to actually go to the people who we're trying to appeal to find out, well, what do you really want to hear? What do you really want to discuss? So that's what we try to do. And the first topic was suggested by the University of Guyana Economics Society. The students had a list of 5 topics that they thought would be of value to discuss. And we asked them to select one of them for the inaugural UGGI conversations, and they came up with the one on sanctions. So that's the concept behind UGGI conversations. We really wanted to appeal to students. We have some other ideas about how we can encourage a more competitive approach to actually coming up with the topic. Have it online, have students actually vote for the best topic or the one that they like the most. And that's something we'll pursue once we get this first one off the ground, once we get a better sense of how the students react to it, what their response is, what their comments, critiques are about it, then we can start to fine-tune the event. So that's it in a nutshell. It's now my pleasure to introduce very briefly our hostess and moderator for today's webinar and the first UGGI conversation, Ms. Bibi Narain. And the name is a familiar one to many Guyanese because Bibi has been in the broadcasting industry for over 30 years. I remember when her voice was a household voice, her name was a household name. And she does have a very mellow voice, and that's probably why she was on radio for a lot of the time. She is currently still in the broadcasting industry, mostly at the advertising end of the industry, and she's pursuing a master's degree in, I believe is it communication studies?
Public administration.
Public administration. I'm sorry.
That's all right.
And I don't want to go on forever, but I know we have the perfect moderator for today's event. And I will now hand you over to Ms. Bibi Narain, and I shall mute my mic and get off the screen. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much. I am Bibi, and I'm delighted to share this forum with you, not only because the learned Dr. Thomas Singh invited me to be a part of it, for which I thank him, but because of the presence of the eminent panelists who are prepared to help us all take control by virtue of sharing their knowledge on issues of significance to us here, as well as the entire world. So interconnected, we are. I wish to express our thanks to them, the panelists, on behalf of the University of Guyana. They are Mr. Mike Lewis, a conflict researcher and former United Nations Sanctions monitor. He is joining us from the UK, and Mr. Dennis Pyle, and he's lecturer in the Department of Economics, University of Guyana. He has been lecturing there for 7 years in that department, I believe. And we thank them for making the effort to be a part of this, our inaugural conversation of the University of Guyana's Green Institute, referred to as a student-oriented engagement that focuses on matters pertaining to sustainability and the preservation not only, which is very significant, very, very significant, not only of humanity, but of life, and the achievement of an equilibrium that allows for the nurturing of each component in a chain of dependency. We're all very dependent on each other and subsequently all very vulnerable. It is therefore with caution that we must approach our strategies for progress and development. Now, to get proceedings going, we will invite Mr. Dominic Gaskin to start the proceedings by inviting panelists to share with us some of their views. Could we do that?
Yes, we can indeed. I think the format would be that the students of the UGES, I think one representative, one or more, I believe it is Ms. Celine Chase, who will make a brief presentation on the topic on behalf of the UGES. And thereafter, we'll have an open discussion. The idea was that each of the panelists would also have a first round presentation, and then the discussion would flow from there, moderated by your good self. So with that, I then invite Ms. Celine Chase on behalf of the University of Guyana Economic Society to make the opening presentation. Thank you. Ms. Chase?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I'm unable to share screen. I have a bit of a PowerPoint presented here. Is that possible to allow me to share, or do I go forward without it? Hello?
You could go. You have a PowerPoint to share?
Yes, I do actually.
You go ahead. You go right ahead. That's all right.
Lovely, thank you.
The host would have to enable screen sharing. I think that's what Ms. Chase is asking.
That would be Dr. Thomas Singh.
Yes, can you see the screen?
We're seeing the screen now. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Once again, my name is Celine Chase, and I am here on behalf of the UGES to present our question and our concerns. And we all know that today's conversation will surround economic sanctions and who ultimately pay the price. Now, we're aware that sanctions are economic penalties targeted at countries or entities who oppose a nation's ideologies, foreign policy objectives, and or intervene in their interests. Essentially, their bilateral agreements are held hostage until the violation is absolved and or a new agreement is established. Sanctions are considered the most popular or palatable tool of war, short of military intervention, especially by powerhouse economies of the developed world. Here we had a few types of economic sanctions just for our viewers to conceptualize. Just for viewers to conceptualize what sanctions actually do. We have trade embargoes or trade blockages, asset freezing, which prohibits the defendant from managing their assets and are based in the accuser's jurisdiction, financial prohibitions, which would restrict the defendant from access to certain financial markets, and tariffs, which are taxes on goods. And from this perspective, it is aimed to thwart the demand for the defendant's exports. Sorry. Yes, now historically, the world has witnessed how the outcomes of sanctions have varied, and as such, their effectiveness have been criticized. British diplomat Jeremy Greenstock suggests that sanctions are popular not because they are known to be effective, but because, quote, there is nothing else to do between words and military action if you want to bring pressure upon a government. The efficacy of sanctions have been reviewed in various literature, as seen here, most discussing their declining utility and counterproductiveness. Take, for example, R. Wright's recent article, Why Sanctions Too Often Fail, from the New Yorker. She discusses the failures of sanctions imposed by the US, specifically highlighting how they have backfired, affecting both the US and the defendants. And I will quote, "Years of sanctions have failed in North Korea, Venezuela, and Iraq. Cuba has faced layers of US trade and arms embargoes since 1960, yet the communist regime is still in power. The Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad, faced multiple sanctions for his brutal repression after the Arab Spring uprising in 2011, which turned into a civil war. Hundreds and thousands have died, yet Assad is still firmly entrenched in Damascus. Success in South Africa took 3 decades. And the Iran model, which the US has invoked for Russia, has had gyrating effects. Haas's Economic Sanctions, Too Much of a Bad Thing from 1998, expresses many criticisms, claiming that, quote, sanctions alone are unlikely to achieve desired results if the aims are large or time is short, and that sanctions are, quote, blunt instruments to often produce unintended and undesirable consequences, where sanctions fatigue tends to settle in over time and the international compliance tend to diminish. Now, from these criticisms, we recognize a trend of devastating humanitarian impacts of these sanctions. Some policy analysts believe imposing economic sanctions only serve to hurt ordinary people as opposed to governing elites, pointing to many serious flaws, including the humanitarian suffering of innocent civilians, the lack of clear criteria for lifting, and the failure of sanctions to put direct pressure on government leaders. Here we have relatively recent reports and studies surrounding this matter. We can reference Haas's article again, where he quotes, all too often, the economic, humanitarian, and foreign policy costs of a country's sanctions far outweigh any benefits. He discusses the humanitarian impacts of sanctions, especially the deterioration of standard of living and socioeconomic conditions of targeted countries. Now, in response to the most recent offenses committed by the Russian Federation in 2022, a staggering array of sanctions have been imposed on bilateral agreements surrounding oil, banking, and other exports. But Russia seems to be relentless in its pursuit of sovereign takeover, despite the fact that these sanctions have induced financial crisis, shortages in basic commodities, and an economic crash in the long run, drastically affecting the lives of their civilians. This is essentially why we are here, to seek elaboration on this subject with a view to understanding the true outcomes of sanctions and how well they achieve the intended objectives. The specific objective is of interest to Guyanese, since Guyana is bordered by a powerful neighbor to the west, which has continued to aggressively poke their border controversy, which settled definitively over a century ago. Without the military strength to defend itself against aggression, Guyana is forced to depend on international action in the unlikely event of a military invasion. So the question comes, how effective are economic sanctions, and who really feels the full forces? Is this the right method of punishment? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlene. And I got your name right. I hope I did.
Is Celine?
Celine. Sorry about that. Thank you very much, Celine. And now we will turn our attention to our panelists. Mr. Mike Lewis, would you like to take the lead on that one, to be followed by Mr. Dennis Pyle?
Certainly. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm going to be very brief in my... Great. Thank you, Ms. Nelaine. And thank you also to Dr. Singh's kind introduction and invitation, and to Ms. Chase's excellent framing of the questions we're going to be talking about today. I think it's extremely apt that the Green Institute in Guyana is thinking about these questions, because they touch so closely, as Ms. Chase said, on questions of resource sovereignty, which I know is a central topic of your inquiries at your institute. And also, of course, because of the kind of economic interconnections that both make sanctions work and make them painful. You only need to look at the involvement of companies like Rusal, for example, in the Guyanese economy, which is now coming slowly into the crosshairs of international sanctions now that its part owner, Oleg Deripaska, has been sanctioned by both the US and the EU. It's also striking for me to be invited to speak to a student-led discussion, because it induces a kind of temporal vertigo. When I was a student at university over 20 years ago, I helped to run an organization called the Campaign Against Sanctions on Iraq. It was a campaign group, an international campaign group, which was campaigning against the unjust economic and social pain caused by the unprecedented sanctions that were levied against Iraq in the 1990s under UN Security Council mandate. A total trade embargo, which was only lightly moderated towards the end of the 1990s. And there was consequently an incredible human toll that the sanctions on Iraq in the 90s took. The mortality figures associated with those sanctions are still hotly disputed, but it's clear that the Iraqi economy essentially went into reverse. Adult literacy dropped from 80 to 58%. There was no wages for teachers. There was a 50% decrease in electricity production capacity. Hospitals were empty of medicine, and so on and so on. And so in the late 1990s, when I was a student, was really the last time, until about 2 months ago, that the international community, such as it is, was willing to impose blanket trade sanctions, that's to say blockades on economies. And the terrible human toll of the blockade on Iraq during the 1990s, coupled with the political fallout of the subsequent US-led invasion of Iraq, meant that for the next 20 years, the 20 years that I have spent as a sanctions monitor, have been a period in which those kinds of blanket sectoral sanctions have been unthinkable. At least multilaterally. The US has kind of done its own thing that we can talk about a little bit later. So that was the last time the international community could put a comprehensive trade and financial embargo on a country. What happened in those intervening 20 years was also a kind of war against sanctions in the UN Security Council, waged particularly by Russia and China, to block the imposition of new sanctions, particularly in relation to situations like Syria, to prevent the Security Council and the Secretary General from appointing sanctions monitors like myself, and a kind of concerted diplomatic effort to delegitimize sanctions as an international instrument at all. So that was the situation until 2 months ago. And then, in an incredibly short period of time, we've seen, sectoral economic and financial sanctions roaring back into the international frame in a way that I didn't expect to see in my lifetime. And I want to make a kind of very clear distinction at the start, therefore, about the difference between the sanctions that the Security Council, the UN Security Council has imposed for the last 20 years, which have been targeted sanctions, that's to say, sanctions against individuals and sanctions against companies, named individuals and companies, rather than sectoral sanctions, with a few exceptions, like certain sectoral sanctions on North Korea in the last couple of years. And other than arms embargoes applied against countries, there haven't been any major multilateral economic sanctions, really, of the kind that we're discussing today. That's to say, blockade sanctions. What we've seen are filters, targeted sanctions against individuals and companies. I'm not sure they have been any more successful necessarily than the kind of blockade sanctions of the 1990s and that we're seeing against Russia now. But they were certainly different in the same way that, you know, a handgun is different to an aircraft carrier. Both are, you know, weapon systems of some kind, but they work in completely different ways. They are controlled in different ways. And, you know, in the same way as you can't compare a handgun and an aircraft carrier, I don't think you can compare a targeted sanction, you know, freezing an individual's bank accounts versus freezing the foreign reserves of an entire country, which we've seen in the case of Russia's foreign reserves in the last month. So I think we need to be very specific about what kinds of sanctions we are talking about. That's very important. The other thing that I just wanted to raise before I pass on to my other panelists, because I've spoken quite long, is that it's important to be clear about who sanctions are levied for and who they're levied against. I spent some time as a sanctions monitor in Darfur in Sudan at the end of the around 2010 and 2011, at a time when there was near deadlock in the UN Security Council about the expansion of sanctions, at a time when there was supposed to be, for example, a UN Security Council prohibition as part of that sanctions package on any military overflights or bombings in the states of Darfur. And yet I used to sit every morning with my coffee at Al Basha airport and watch Sudanese Air Force transport aircraft and attack helicopters take off and for bombing raids, those same bombing raids that were supposed to have been prohibited by sanctions. And that continued day in, day out in the full glare of publicity and in full visibility of the United Nations for a decade, several sorties a week for a decade. So it was clear that there were situations against which, for which there were people for which the international community would not levy sanctions or would not enforce sanctions that it had levied. And to put it frankly, generally speaking, those people were not white. And it's also the case that during those 20 years that I've spoken about, the country targets of sanctions tended also not to be white. There was a kind of racism built into international sanctions. And that's something that is very striking about the new sanctions against Russia. I think it's the first time that I can think of where multilateral sanctions at scale have been, to put it bluntly, have been applied against white people, in this case, the Russian Federation. But I recall that, the regime of post-war sanctions as an instrument short of war, as Ms. Chase said, were initially invented essentially in the 1970s as an instrument against racism. The first post-war trade sanctions that were imposed by the United Nations and by other states were against the white regime in Rhodesia. And it was an eminent Guyanese statesman, Sir Sridhar Ramphal, who really pushed for the enforcement and the expansion of those sanctions as Commonwealth Secretary General between 1975 and in the late 1970s. And in a speech that he gave to the General Assembly in the late 1970s, Sonny Ramphal said this. He said, "Sanctions can be made more effective if they are applied with relentless and unswerving commitment." And I think it's that's a kind of a very striking voice from another age. I know that Shushura Ramphal is still with us, but it's a striking kind of voice from another age, that there was a time when sanctions were an instrument of solidarity against racism. Sonny Ramphal also called in the General Assembly for sanctions against Portugal, or a trade embargo against Portugal, as part of solidarity for the liberation struggles in Angola and Mozambique at that time. So I think we need to think hard about, as I said, about the kinds of people against whom the international community is willing to levy sanctions at any one time, and for whom the international community is willing to levy sanctions. And we need to be attentive and cautious about hypocrisy in both those things. That's all I have to say for now, but I'm very happy to talk in more detail about.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mike Lewis. For those of you who might have just joined us, Mr. Mike Lewis is a conflict researcher and former United Nations sanctions monitor, and he is joining us from the United Kingdom. I'll now ask Mr. Dennis Pyle, lecturer in the Department of Economics, University of Guyana, to please join us with your comments to Ms. Celine Chase's question. Thank you.
Hey, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
It's really a pleasure to be with Ms. Bibi Narayan. I remember your voice since I was a child growing up, when radio was all that we had. We saw everything through the radio, we heard it through the radio, and it's truly a delight to still hear your voice here today.
Thank you, Mark.
And so, Ms. Chase, thank you also for your introductory analysis of the issue at hand. Certainly, I want to agree with Mike in the manner in which you framed the discussion. And of course, Mike went a step further by laying out some demarcations, some historical context, as well as setting up within the United Nations, particularly how the UN generally addressed the issue of sanctions, which was pretty much embraced in the 1940s. But I think we also need to ask ourselves, if sanctions is pretty much all that Ms. Chase has contextualized it so far, then it warrants the question as to why is it still here? Why do major countries still impose sanctions? Why have sanctions not become absent in the economic space or in terms of the geopolitical or geoeconomic space? Why do we still have it as such a major foreign policy for many countries? And really, if you as far as history goes, sanctions goes a bit further in terms of its history, being used since in the days of the BC. Some have it around 500 BC there, being used by Athens at that point. And it's still here. And we're talking about sanctions in existence before Christ even walked the earth, and it's still here with us today. In our little later history, we have a case where sanctions was levied against Italian nations, particularly against Mussolini, in getting him to change his approach to a particular nation. And over the years, sanctions has been pretty much evolving in different ways. And I think today we've come to a place, given the history that Mike has laid, and not wanting to recap that, we've come to a place where countries have chosen to use sanctions, as is also argued in literature, as one form of, or the lesser of two evils, pretty much, in terms of achieving their geopolitical goals, their political foreign policy objectives. And it appears to be, irrespective of the social or economic costs associated with its application. Take, for example, Mike outlined quite a very good explanation of, in the case of Iraq, And in terms of human life, just for children, one research it accounts for at least the death of about 500,000. That's just children. So if sanctions really and truly imposes such a tremendous cost, which literature supports that it does in every sense. We have many instances historically to point to in which sanctions has been or has a very negative effect. In fact, later on, I'll talk a little bit more about some of the data that is out there about the impact of sanctions. But we still have to ask the question, and we must ask the question, in spite of all the data that we have, and in spite of what we understand today, in spite of the facts that we have today, why is sanctions still a go-to mechanism used by developed countries? Now, Mike did present a particular point of view in terms of framing the application of sanctions and its target agents or its target objects, the countries that suffer most from its application. And he framed the discussion by referencing an element of the disparity in people groups. And that might be, and that is, of course, a useful perspective. But I also think there is another element that is a part of the application of sanctions, which has to do with countries that have a certain extensive deposits of natural resources, particular type of natural resources. It's interesting to note that several of the countries, including Russia, Iran, Syria, Venezuela, some countries with large oil deposits, oil reserves, are some of the more sanctioned countries in the world. And I don't necessarily think that's because it's coincidental. Neither is it coincidental that some of the countries that have some of the larger gas deposits as well are also very heavily sanctioned. I don't, again, think these things are coincidental. But why have sanctions been so both devastating and, according to those countries who have used them, why do they think they have been so effective? And here's where I want to insert particularly something that Mike kind of inserted into the discussion, has to do with the application of sanctions. Now, there's one research that looked at the impact of sanctions, being administered by the UN, and impact of sanctions being administered by individual countries. And I know we're going to talk a little more about that. And the consequence that are associated with the two different approaches, the effectiveness of those two different approaches. And I will share a little more about that as we go on. But I think also in framing our ideas as well in this discussion, it is useful to consider some questions or some statements rather that Dr. Mark Bayos had presented while he was president of the Constitutional Court of Belgium. And he, in assessing sanctions, he asked these questions. These are questions that are posed. Are sanctions imposed for valid reasons? Are sanctions imposed for valid reasons? Now, this is a question that must be answered irrespective of what our disposition or proclivity might be towards a particular issue, whether we think it's justified or not. We may need to at least give an honest consideration of whether or not the imposition of sanctions has a valid reason. And he also posed the question, do sanctions target the relevant parties? Relevant parties. Do sanctions, third question, do sanctions target the relevant goods or objects? His fourth question was, are sanctions reasonable, time limited? Are sanctions reasonable, time limited? Fifth question, are sanctions effective, and are sanctions free from the protests arising from violations of the principles of humanity and the dictates of public conscience? So I think these questions will help to frame and to guide our ideas, even as we consider that in the current environment, when we look, I mean, I think we need not look very far for a useful example of how at least individual countries apply sanctions, how severe they can be. If we think about recent COVID, and Mike did mention North Korea, one of the countries that is considered to be more, or was considered to be one of the more heavily sanctioned countries. There is an element of individual sanctions by countries that at times come over as inhumane. For during COVID, the application of sanctions, particularly by some of the national countries, restricted access to food, medicine, healthcare, and types of essential services. So we then are faced with the question, what it is that we really want to achieve. And part of the whole principle of sanctions has to do with having a very clear objective. For some argue that Iran was able to enter into negotiation with the Americans and some of the other world leading countries as a consequence of sanctions that give birth to the JCPOA, when the objective of the sanctions at that time was clear, meaning not focused on regime change, but rather towards nuclear weapons. So I think as we here today exchange ideas on this very question, and particularly as we shift a little later on to what might it mean for a country like Guyana, of which there is some consideration to that question as well, especially when we think a little bit more about the 1960s, and particularly in the 1980s, early 1980s, when Ronald Reagan came into power, and this part of the world still entrenched in the communism, an ideology that was incongruent with the then capitalists, and the application of policies at that time that brought about some changes in Guyana's approach to economic issues and its political positions at that time. So we will discuss these things as we consider this issue of sanctions, which of course is very close to us, as our colleague Celine has rightly presented in her discussion early on. So that's much as I would say. Bibi, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Dennis Pyle. And thank you very much, Ms. Celine Chase, for that rather stimulating question. If there's anyone else, could you please, by showing your hands, or you could please feel free to turn your mic on and ask a question, a follow-up question perhaps? Denzel Passad, feel free. Good afternoon to you and welcome to the forum.
Good afternoon, everyone. I have a question for Mr. Lewis. I believe he could give us a good view on the European perspective. Now, I believe the main contention with the sanctions topic this time would be the Russian sanctions. Essentially, the entire world. Well, one second. Yes, sorry about that. Most of the world has either outright condemned Russia verbally or engaged in the sanctions. I believe that's correct. One particular thing I'd like to touch on is Japan. Japan, I believe, has been the country which has suffered the most from these sanctions. The yen has seen a catastrophic dip in value. And if it wasn't for US intervention, which they didn't give freely, they were very reluctant, uh, Japan could have seen a very massive dip in their economic output, given the drop in the value of the yen. The US and the EU seems to use sanctions as a weapon to bludgeon their adversaries with the cost of our prosperity. Guyana, India, Japan, so on. Why do they have such a disdain for our well being? Why do they use us as weapons? Why is this their perspective?
Thank you very much.
Ms. Nato, do you want to gather a few questions and then myself and Mr.
Sure.
Powell will respond,
Very
or,
well.
or however you want to run it?
Perhaps you could respond to this one.
Yes, of course.
And then
Yeah,
you can always ask. Yes.
sure. No, thank you very much for your question, Mr. Persaud. And obviously, you know, I can't speak for the European Union or for European states. And I want to be clear, you know, at the start of this discussion that I am, I suppose, a kind of reluctant apologist for sanctions of certain kinds, and we'll get on to what kinds I think might be permissible and not permissible in a minute. And I do think that some kind of international economic response or the use of certain kinds of economic instruments against such blatant and catastrophic Russian aggression is legitimate in this instance. As you say, one of the issues is that there isn't really built into a sanctions mechanism a kind of impact assessment. In the case of the Iraq sanctions that both myself and Mr. Powell mentioned, it wasn't until 1999, which was 8 years after the start of the trade embargo, that there was any serious attempt to measure, for example, the impact of the sanctions on under 5 mortality. And there certainly wasn't much discussion prior to that of its effects on Iraqi infrastructure, on electricity generation, on prices, and so on. So I think you're absolutely right, of course, to say that there needs to be assessment on sanctions impact on other economies, efforts made to mitigate those impacts. And I think one of the issues about the current round of Russia sanctions is that it's been designed, I think, for the most part, by economists, by bankers and finance people, and by political scientists. And the theory behind it seems to be that to inflict broad economic pain on the Russian population and specific economic pain on elite business people and political elites through sanctions against oligarchs will be a way to weaken popular and political support for the war in Ukraine. One, I think, kind of casualty of that set of considerations when designing the European sanctions has been that there hasn't been so much thought about how sanctions and what kinds of sanctions might actually directly degrade Russia's capability to project military force and perpetrate war crimes in Ukraine, or indeed elsewhere. Which was always, that kind of direct military or strategic impact was always the, originally the kind of consideration of the kinds of targeted sanctions that we've seen in the last 20 years in Sudan, in North Korea, in Iran, in other places. And I just wanted to kind of illustrate that with one very kind of brief comparison. So I don't know if I'm able to share my screen. I don't know if Dr. Singh can allow me to do that. But in the meantime, yes, I was very struck by. Oh, thank you.
Or Dominic, you could do that. I made you host.
And while I'm waiting for that, I would also say that in terms of economic pain, that it's, what we would call economic blowback from the current round of sanctions. I think the extraordinarily high energy prices that pertain at the moment in Europe as well as elsewhere are one, clear consequence. So I don't think it's only economies outside of Europe that are suffering. But yeah, in terms of the kinds of the sort of targeting of sanctions, I was struck by a comparison between two vessels, two ships that I saw recently. This is the first one. This is the Amadea. It's a luxury yacht that belongs purportedly to a Russian businessman, a sanctioned Russian businessman from Sulman Kerimov. It was seized yesterday in Fiji. And one of the, the most kind of sort of dramatic and kind of theatrical of the Russian sanctions, I think legitimate. I think it's entirely legitimate to target oligarchs who are making money and providing political support to Vladimir Putin. But nonetheless, it certainly is a kind of quite a dramatic and media-worthy side to sanctions. It has been the effort to seize and freeze yachts, luxury aircraft, these kinds of things belonging to sanctioned Russian oligarchs. So here's a ship that was seized under actually it was on the request of the US on this occasion, US Treasury sanctions. And then this vessel, if you can see it, is a general cargo vessel, which is currently actually called the Ursa Major. And this vessel recently transited from the Black Sea up through the Mediterranean, round through the English Channel or the French Channel, depending on your point of view, past Denmark and into the Baltic Sea, passing through several EU member states' territorial waters as they went, entirely without impediment, it seems. It's a vessel that is controlled by companies that are subsidiaries of the Russian Ministry of Defense. It's a vessel that was being moved from the Black Sea to the Baltic in order to begin cargo operations for the strategically important cargo link between Kaliningrad, the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad, and the Russian mainland, which is liable to be disrupted by because the rail link between those two places goes through Lithuania and EU member states. So a strategically significant cargo route, also because Kaliningrad is Russia's only all-year European port. And yet it was able, in contrast to many oligarchs' yachts, it was able to pass through European Union waters themselves unimpeded, because the companies that control it, even though they're owned by the Russian Ministry of Defense, are not specifically under EU sanction. And I think that is symptomatic of the fact that, as Mr. Powell said, the selection of current Russia sanctions has been much more about broad brush economic pain than it has been about having specific effects on degrading the military assets and the revenues of the Russian military in particular. And so I'm not criticizing the EU sanctions as a package, but I do think that there needs to be more consideration and more targeting of specifically those bits of the Russian state that are projecting force and perpetrating war crimes. And I think that would be helpful. I'm not sure if that's an adequate response to your question. I think it's.
I have a quick follow-up, right?
Yeah, please.
The ruble is at this point at the same level or probably even higher than it was before the invasion of Eastern Europe, right?
Yeah.
Russian oil and Russian natural gas booming. So that oligarch that lost his yacht is probably making more money and he could buy 2 more yachts. So it doesn't really make much of a difference. You talk about the Europeans having increased fuel energy prices, I should say, but the vast difference between our spending power and their spending power, it doesn't compare. You have to. I don't think any level of sanction, because one thing we must admit, China is backing Russia. Anything we could deny that, the West could deny them in terms of imports, China could supplement that. And Russia is a large country. They make a lot of the stuff they use. So sanctioning their imports wouldn't have an effect on their local production. In fact, it would even bolster internal production and probably even boost their GDP, boosting local industry. So, all in all, this has been the best thing that happened to Russia in probably the last, I don't know, 50 years.
Yeah, actually, so there's two parts to that. One is about energy, and one is about import substitution, effectively, I think. And Dennis, if you want to come in, please don't hesitate, because I don't want to monopolize this.
Oh,
discussion.
I mean, great. I know you're the guy in the moment, right? But
No,
let me make a comment here, because I think
Please.
Denzel need to think a bit more carefully about how he's understanding the issue. For example, there is one research that shows that UN sanctions has the capacity to lower GDP between 2 to 5% over a 10-year period. Whereas an individual country, for example, any of the large countries imposing sanctions, has a 1% GDP potential costs, economic costs attached to it. So how does that fit into what Denzel is talking about? Now, let me give a sidebar before I follow through with that expression. For example, recently, in a matter of days, I think it was BP, which was one of the companies that pulled out of the Russian oil industry, in its pulling out forecast of $5 billion loss. And as a consequence of the current environment, it has only a couple of days ago declared it had made $9 billion profit. So I was saying to someone, well, this is good. War is really good. This is working out just right. I mean, to pull out on a forecast of a $5 billion loss and then earn $9 billion profit, this has to be good. But we have to think more about, not just about the immediate. In fact, most analysis of empirical work in relation to sanctions is more about what do you see happening in the long run? What do you see happening in the next 3 years, 5 years, in the next 10 years? And it's an environment in which you will find a country operating on the severe constraints as it relates to its interaction with the rest of the world, particularly as you become more narrow in your access to financial systems. So while there is a natural and an evidential temporal windfall, as it appears to be, I'm sure the Russians are not particularly so much rejoicing, even though I have a kind of a different proclivity in relation to how sanctions or why sanctions are applied to Russia under these conditions. Not absolving ourselves from the historical context relating to that gives rise to this current reality. And one must understand the historical context that gave rise to this current reality. And this is by no means a comment in favor of war, because obviously there is a cost to the innocent, there is a cost to women and children, there's a cost to the vulnerable. But in the larger context of the matter, we have to consider, if we will clearly understand the issue. Now, someone may ask, who is looking from the outside? All right, so this is Russia and Ukraine, right, Denzel? And it seems to be a case where a larger country is imposing its, let's say, its military might on another. And that seems to be, by all means, morally wrong. There is obviously no equivalency in this subject. But we have so many other examples of a similar or worse reference in terms of big countries imposing will on small countries. And the wars in Libya has so often mentioned, and many of the countries that are sharing liberal volume of sanctions are some of the very countries that are responsible for the complete disintegration of an entire sovereign country. Libya was a sovereign country. Syria is still a sovereign country, or was supposed to be. So too of Afghanistan were supposed to be sovereign countries. So sovereignty becomes a subject of countries that are capable and have the might, one, to both qualify and mobilize around their special interests, while at the same time have the economic space to support those interests. In this particular issue with Russia and Ukraine, there is so much to talk about it. And we have to begin by acknowledging that war in every sense is wrong. War in every sense is costly, it's unjustified, it's immoral, and whatever else we can throw at it. But war does not come out of nowhere. And particularly in this case with Russia and Ukraine. For example, I remember not so long ago, there is Mike, just like you, there was, I don't remember this young lady's name, this woman's name, but she was very passionate, and she was speaking about what's happening in some of the, like, for example, what's going on in Mali over there with the French, some asking how it is that we have, only today, I read the Mexican president is asking that we've been asking the US for just $3 billion to deal with our issue, but the Americans can find how much billion of dollars to sponsor the Ukrainian war. So we have to be able to understand that this is not just a war, by no means. This is a scenario of the political mighty countries, the geopolitical structure that is fighting out in Ukraine. And that's the whole idea of sanctions, isn't it? It's an avenue that allow countries to escape the direct contact, especially nuclear countries, to avoid direct contact, while at the same time posturing in order to defend their own, what they may define as their national interests or national security interests. So we have to take into account that this war in Ukraine, wherever it will settle, and at whatever cost it will settle, when we reflect on it, it isn't going to be as a consequence of because Russia had more missiles or Ukraine had too few missiles, but it will have to take into account all of the political preferences of external forces, of external countries that were reflected in a war that should have never been in the first instance. And again, which side of that argument one may position themselves? Perhaps it will be based on your geographical location and how you're cultured in your understanding of geopolitical issues and these types of subjects. So Mike, let me allow you to jump right in again on the matter there.
No, thank you, guys. Yeah, and look, I would absolutely echo what you said at the start about the fact that the impact of sanctions are always medium term. These are not instruments that have immediate effects in many cases, particularly with trade and commercial sanctions, which have, kind of medium range effects on, as existing stocks of goods run down and so on. So yeah, I think we're 2 months in with the Russia sanctions. It's to be seen yet what, their economic impact, how their economic impact plays out on the Russian economy, and particularly how long Russia can continue to prop up the value of the ruble, as you mentioned, Mr. Basod. How long it can continue to maintain the capital controls that prop up its value, how long it can continue to force customers to transact in rubles in order to support its value. So I think the recovery of the ruble is something that I think may play out quite differently in the medium term. But to come back to the question of oil and gas, particularly because I know that is also central to the Green Institute's kind of mandate. You're absolutely right. Of course, that Russia's revenue from oil and gas has doubled in the last 2 months. They made something like 62 billion euros in oil and gas sales in March and April. The largest customer was Germany. There is effect. There are, so there are problems about how European countries are paying for oil and gas and whether they are permitted to transact in rubles or in dollars and the payment mechanisms therein. But to all intents and purposes, there are not oil and gas sanctions on Russia at the moment. There's uncertainty in the market, and that has definitely elevated prices. And that's a clear impact of the kind of geopolitical situation. But I don't think it's fair to say that there are oil and gas sanctions. And I think that's a pattern that I've seen played out in many other places as well. And to go back to my experience in Sudan, when I used to sit with my coffee and watch the military planes taking off from El Fasher Airport in Darfur, I was very conscious that the reason that those aircraft were still flying, the fact that they could still go and buy parts in Moscow and various other places, was because there were never any multilateral sanctions on Sudan's oil exports. This was before the secession of South Sudan, and so Sudan was still earning half of its government revenue and 95% of its exports in oil exports at that time. So even in the middle of genocide, there was never, the international community didn't want to shoulder the pain of not having access to oil exports from wherever, and that's clearly the case with Russia as well. There were also other very striking exemptions to the US sanctions on Sudan all the way through the 2000s. No matter how vociferous the human rights campaigners were about what was happening in Darfur, there was always an exemption, for example, for gum arabic, which is a substance that's harvested in Sudan and used for all sorts of foodstuffs and other reasons. One of the things that it does is that it stabilizes Coca-Cola. So it's an ingredient in Coca-Cola which helps sugar basically not to kind of precipitate out of Coca-Cola. And so there was always a US exemption on gum arabic, so Coke could continue to be that kind of iconic US drink could always be produced, and that was economically significant for Sudan. They produced, by some estimates, between 40 and 80% of the world's supply of gum arabic. So yeah, I think you're right that sanctions are always imposed selectively according to how much economic pain those imposing them are willing to shoulder themselves, and that's I suppose a kind of element of hypocrisy. But to come back to your central question, I think there's something discordant about claiming on the one hand that economic sanctions can have terrible effects on civilian economies, and they can, absolutely, as if they are imposed as blockades, as broad sectoral sanctions for long periods of time, multilaterally. But on the other hand, you can't claim that and also claim that they rarely successfully affect the economic capacities of the targeted states. That that imports can be endlessly substituted, that industry is kind of fungible, that Russia is just going to continue as business as usual. Because if economic resources are so fungible, why can't they be directed towards sustaining populations? If World War I Germany under European embargo could build new artillery guns under blockade, how come it could do that and not feed its population? And so I think it's important to think, why it is that often sanctions disrupt people's economic life, but not necessarily the economic life of states. And that's about sanctions design rather than about the fact of sanctions themselves. It's because if you design sanctions wrong, they allow states, democratic or not, who care more about airplanes and steel mills than they do about their civilian populations, to prioritize their steel mills over feeding their children. And so we need to attribute culpability also to the targets of those sanctions as well, to where they decide how to use their economic resources. I won't say any more than that, but yeah, happy to continue the discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Mike Lewis, and once again, Mr. Dennis Bott. Charlene Wilkinson, I am not sure if she still requires a clarification. I see in the chat that she does with respect to the assumption that war in every sense is wrong. And then we have Lawrence Lewis to everyone. Just read that Hungary is saying that the sanctions against Russia with regards to its exports of oil and oil products to Hungary is an atomic bomb. So sanctions affect all. I would have seen Denzel's hand again, and then he took it down. I am not sure whether he changed his mind.
I just wanted to make one clarification.
Go ahead.
I didn't assert that all sanctions are ineffective. I was just speaking to the fact that since Russia has Chinese backing in this sense, the sanctions would not be as effective. And economists, I understand that this is a chat filled with economists, but we're looking at the long term economic effect, and we're discounting the long term geopolitical effect. The long term geopolitical effect would see Russia and China having increased relations, forming a new Eastern Soviet bloc. And that's really what all of this is pushing towards. And history doesn't repeat, but it sure does rhyme. And that's my major contention with this whole war. We'll see a separation of the world economy into two separate economies, East and West, and then sanctions won't do anything at all.
I think I absolutely agree with you on that. The great difference between the catastrophic sanctions of the 1990s and the current sanctions against Russia are precisely that those of the 1990s were imposed globally by the UN Security Council and had the support, that rare moment of unanimity between all of the P5, the permanent members of the UN Security Council. That's absolutely not the case, as you say, with the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia. If you look at who voted in the General Assembly to censure Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I think it was only about half of the world's GDP and about half of the world's population. So I think one of the kind of untold diplomatic tragedies of the last 10 years has been the complete paralysis of the UN Security Council, which has traditionally been the forum within which sanctions have been decided. That paralysis, I have to say, has been led primarily by Russia and China, for better or for worse. And I think with a mix of good and bad intentions, certainly with an eye to the fact that sanctions have indeed been abused by some of the other members of the Security Council in the past, but also with a deliberate purpose of blocking sanctions that might be imposed, for example, on war criminals in Syria that are aligned to Russia, or in other desperate situations. So I absolutely agree with that. But I just wanted also to come back to take these Charlene and Lawrence's points together about war versus sanctions and about the indiscriminacy of sanctions against Russia with regard to oil and oil products to Hungary. There's two things to say about that. One is, as I said before, there is no blanket prohibition on the import of oil and oil products by Russia into Hungary right now, into any EU country. So I think that's kind of, to some degree, that's bombast by Viktor Orban, by the president of Hungary. There's even, has recently been introduced a prohibition on Russian flagged ships calling at European ports. But there's a total exemption on ships carrying oil and oil products and other products as well, food and various other products. So yeah, I think that's kind of bombast. But in terms of Charlene's question, look, I'm not a pacifist, and but I think it would be helpful actually to conceptualize sanctions as weapons. I am sometimes comfortable with the use of weapons, military weapons, in very narrow circumstances. But I'm also comfortable with the use of certain kinds of targeted sanctions in very narrow circumstances. But I think it's absolutely right to consider them as weapons, as economic weapons, in the word of Nick Mulder's excellent recent book, with all of the responsibilities to prevent indiscriminacy that the use of a weapon entails. I think if we apply the same kinds of considerations that we have in international humanitarian law against the use of military weapons, but they must be proportionate, it must not be indiscriminate. If we apply those principles to sanctions design as economic weapons, I think that would be very, very helpful.
If there are no other questions, perhaps we should say at this point in time we're nearing the wrap-up hour. In fact, we have gone past the wrap-up hour, which should be 4 o'clock, I think. But however, depending on our guests, whether they would like to be around for another few minutes to accommodate questions coming from persons who would have just come in, feel free to let me know if you could share with us a few more minutes, maybe 5 to 10 more minutes. Mr. Mike Lewis, Mr. Dennis Pyle, is that possible? Before wrapping up. Thank you, Mr. Pyle. That's all right with you too?
Yeah, please.
Thank you. If there's anyone else who would like to ask a question pertaining to sanctions and you have perhaps just come in, feel free to raise your hand or you can place it in the chat. But we have just about 10 minutes left with these gentlemen who have so graciously consented to giving their time to accommodate this discussion this afternoon. Feel free, we will give you a few to indicate. If not, we will hand over to the panelists for maybe a brief wrap up from both of them. And then we hand over to Mr. Dominic Gaskin, who will do the closing piece.
Well, let me jump right in and allow Mike to give the wrapping in. But let's just turn our attention for a moment to Guyana, because I've shared early on, I do believe that sanction has played a significant role, particularly in influencing and promulgating geopolitical interests of large countries, specifically with reference to countries that have significant deposits of natural resources. And in this case, we are considering what may be the implication to a country like Guyana that has recently been on the upside in terms of the development of an oil sector, albeit in a climate change environment. And that in itself has its own story to tell. But let's remember for a moment that in the 1960s, sanctions indeed they were used as a tool when at the time the political ideology of the then leaders of Guyana, which was declared in the 1970s, after the PNC came into power in 1964, and we had I think it was around by 1970, maybe 74, 76, where Mr. Burnham declared his Marxist-Leninist type of beliefs or ideology, we may want to call it. And by 1981, when Ronald Reagan came into power in the US, he clearly at the time coming out from that Cold War struggle, because we have to be able to situate these events within the broader context of global events. And just as we were moving out of that big struggle of the Soviet, the USSR kind of ideology there of communism, whatever else they embrace, in conflict with this Western part of the world and the capitalists of this part of the world, much weight, political and economic weight was leveraged on Guyana, and hence leading to what some may believe the shift. Because as you can remember, in 1988-89, as a result of these policies that were targeted towards Guyana and its ideology at that time, it forced massive economic costs onto Guyana at that time. And just for play, I was looking at the population size of the countries that are heavily sanctioned. And the smallest population is Liberia, which is over, I think just over 5 million. With Guyana having what, a dash number of persons, I want to put it mildly. And just as Charlene said, that no chance at all. And so in this environment where we are developing this very significant global interest resource, then it makes much sense that the way we structure our economic policy, the way we choose to become integrated into the world economy must be based on some principle which allows the country not to become or to be categorized as one antagonist to the capitalist system, of which we have no chance to survive against. If you check on our exports, most of Guyana's exports go to the northern world, and just as with, you know, in a simple language, with a press of a button, and Guyana's economy is no more. In 2020, when there was the political instability somewhat, sanction was trumpeted as a potential tool of consequence against. And remember, we should remember that in the UN article, there is some support when it comes to do with the use of sanctions against democracy and political systems and these types of rights that people are supposed to have under an equitable system. And so the use or the threat of sanctions was sufficient, I would want to think. At least it appears to have had its intended influence. And let's think now under the context where Guyana is now expanding, and most of its expansions, recent expansion, is as a consequence of the windfall from its oil production, and where the company producing that windfall is an American company, the country that leveraged the most sanctions in the world across the globe. So if we're thinking and trying to understand the consequence that would befall Guyana, were it to embrace, you know, issues and policies and take political positions that are kind of frictional to the global, you know, the global language of today somewhat, then economically, I don't see Guyana as coming right back full circle to what Caroline said. There's just no economic chance for Guyana survival. And there needs not to even be a contemplation of this issue because, you know, as a developing country, we've made the mistake already in the 1960s, 1970s, and we've seen what that have brought us. We've seen the level of low development, slow development. Goal speaks of the start and stop growth process. These things have not positively influenced our development. And so we're at a point here where we have to be very prudent. We have to take, we need to have more, some would say, more geostrategists who are crafting our policies towards the global market. Sanction is real, and every country have their own interests. And there are going to be cases where those interests will conflict with major countries. But it need not be a case where those differences result in the type of struggle for global positioning that we're seeing among some of the more major countries. So we need to think more prudently. We need to have better strategy in terms of our investment. We need to be a bit more diversified. And this is one of the questions that we look at. Diversification play an important role, not diversification towards import substitution, but diversification in terms of how we position ourselves within the global space and within the global market. And that will better anchor the country against exogenous conditions. So that's much as I would say. I think Mike will have quite a bit to jump in there, so let me allow him to do so. And yes, Caroline, I'm well aware of the apartheid condition. In fact, there's an article in the Washington Post that kind of identified some cases where sanctions have been successful. Mike, you might remember in the Yugoslavia case in the early 1920s, which just the threat of it sometimes, it has that type of influence, and it brings about sometimes, in rare cases, some positive outcomes.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks,
you.
Dennis. Listen, I'll be brief, and I'm fully qualified here to have the last word. But just to return to Dennis's point about the kind of exogenous risks that exist for a country like Guyana in the current geopolitical setup. There is clearly a concern, as some of the speakers have said today, there is clearly concern that the global economy and the sanctions on Russia at the moment are a kind of indication of the potential bifurcation of the global economy back into a kind of Cold War situation where we have, two sets of great powers arraigned against each other. I'm conscious that I'm speaking from the UK, speaking to you in Guyana, with an incredibly grim history, Cold War history of, going back to, the 1953 election and the election of Teddy Reagan and all of the dirty tricks that Britain rolled out in order to, to stoke fears of Soviet influence in Guyana and eventually to take Jagan illegitimately out of power. So, I'm very conscious that I'm speaking, with all of that weight of grim history behind us. And to avoid that kind of bifurcation again is, I think, is absolutely critical. But on the other hand, I think that, actually, Guyana's offshore oil sector is a good case in point where, as Dennis said, okay, so you have ExxonMobil has 45% of the Stabroek field, the largest exploiter, but you've also got 25% held by a Chinese company. You have, alliances, geopolitical alliances embedded in Guyana's offshore oil and gas sector that would have been unthinkable in the 1950s. And I think there is, it's perhaps to be hoped that that kind of economic interconnection is going to continue. And if it's not to be disrupted by sanctions, then those sanctions, as I said before, have to be properly designed and targeted in the same way as we would think about the design and targeting of a weapon. And then the last thing I think to say about that, sanctions and natural resources is that, if I was Guyana right now, if I was the Guyanese government, I would think that any moves to move away from the European consumption of Russian oil and gas could only be good for emerging producers like Guyana. There is already in the UK and elsewhere calls to restart fracking and the hydraulic extraction of gas in order to replace Russian gas supplies, for example. And I think there's an immense environmental risk there as well, that natural resources that unfortunately have to stay in the ground, perhaps with reparations paid by wealthy governments to other countries that keep those resources in the ground. But one of the great possibilities of the current situation with Russia is that it promotes the greater extraction of remaining reserves elsewhere that wouldn't otherwise have been incentivized by the oil price. And so there are immense environmental risks that aren't even beginning to enter into the consideration of sanctions design in the US or in the EU, and we absolutely have to be alive to those threats. Thanks.
Thank you once again. And once again to our students, maybe the proponents, Celine Chase, if there's anything further you would like to add, to ask, please feel free. This is the time to do so. Anyone else? If not, I would just quickly, before I hand over to Dominic, just say thanks to our panelists on behalf of the University of Guyana, Mr. Mike Lewis. I would have informed you before, he's a conflict researcher and former United Nations sanctions monitor, and he has been kind enough to join us from the United Kingdom, and Mr. Dennis Pyle, lecturer, the Department of Economics, University of Guyana. We wish to really thank them both, as well as the students of the University of Guyana for this inaugural presentation of the University of Guyana's Green Institute. Thank you all very much for having made this possible. Now it's over to Mr. Dominic Gaskin for his closing remarks.
Thank you, Bibi. And let me first of all say a big thank you to Bibi, Celine, Dennis, and Mike for bringing us to this point. I thoroughly enjoyed every minute of this discussion. And it, as usual, you know, you scratch the surface on any issue and you realize it's a lot more complicated than whether something is good or bad, or whether it's a necessary evil or a totally unnecessary evil, or whether it's a good thing. And so it is with sanctions. We're not going to leave here necessarily with any consensus on the matter. My big takeaway is the issue of sanctions design. I like the concept, and perhaps if the students are interested in maybe having another round of this discussion at some point later in the year, I think that would be a good starting point, because how do you design sanctions to be effective? What are the ingredients that go into sanctions? You know, how do you target them? How do you implement them, enforce them, so that they actually are very surgical in their impacts and achieve some sort of desired result? So those sorts of things I'd be very interested to hear about at some subsequent time. But thank you very much, everyone. And I also want to thank the audience for attending and for staying with us and for asking questions. And of course, the panel for responding to those questions. So thank you again. And I think this marked the, you know, we got the launch out of the way and we did so very well. And I hope that this is the beginning of many more conversations like this to come. I encourage the students to think of subjects that they're interested in, propose them, not necessarily to the UGGI, but to other students, and have a, you know, let's have a mechanism for deciding what are the topics of interest that students want to hear about. And we'd be more than delighted, the UGGI that is, to, you know, have more of these discussions and hopefully, you know, bring some expertise to bear on some of these matters. So that's it for me. Thank you once again, everyone. Bibi, should I hand back over to you to say goodbye and to close the meeting?
Well, it's just to say bye, everyone. Thank you once again. Nothing I didn't say before. And I like you, I look forward to another of these sessions. It, for me, has been guiding me in terms of my thoughts when we look at all the examples given, when we look at all the outcomes, the sanctions, who are they for, what are they for, who benefit, who don't really benefit. A number of interesting issues came out. Of course, those would have been as a result of the questions that were put forward to our panelists. And I was quite impressed. I was quite impressed. So thank you, everybody. And indeed, we look forward to having another of these. Have a very pleasant afternoon. Bye-bye.
Mike, have a good one over at your side.
Thanks a lot, Dennis. You too. Enjoy your weekend. And thank you again for the opportunity. It's a really great
Thank you. You've been most welcome.
Thank you, Ms. Nareem. Thank you.